Most people watching this video are well aware of the 8-track cartridge, but I suspect there are fewer people who are as familiar with its predecessor, the 4-track cartridge. This is a format that deserves a video of its own, so let's do just that. So we're going to have a bit of history, a bit of a repair, and some useless trivia. So let's get on with it. The 4-track cartridge was the brainchild of Earl "Madman" Muntz, hence the Muntz behind me. We need to go back a few years before the creation of the cartridge, though, to explain a bit more about the Madman part. Earl Muntz was a used car salesman. He created this larger-than-life madman character to sell his used cars on the TV and the radio. It was the whole, my prices are so low, I must be mad kind of thing. He wore a Napoleon hat. Apparently he was the first person to try and sell cars in a less than serious manner, and he became very successful at it. He became a friend to the rich and famous. He was on television. People made jokes about Muntz's cars. Anyway, in 1948, he decided to sell up and move into manufacturing televisions. He was always interested in electronics, and he saw TV manufacture as the next big thing. Apparently he was very into television because he even named his daughter TV. But around this time he must have been very driven, because as well as getting into the televisions, he was also getting into manufacturing a car. There was a Muntz Jet that came out between 1948 and 54. They sold 198 of those. But going back to the television side, Muntz TV was pretty successful. It was the first company to introduce a sub $100 television in the US. Of course, there were black and white models to start with, but in 1956 they got into manufacturing colour. However, they didn't sell as many colour TVs as they'd hoped, and at some point the company had gone bankrupt and then come back out of bankruptcy, and Earl Muntz decided to leave the company. At least that's the official term for it. I think he was asked to leave because the company carried on without him, still called Muntz Television. And as a result, on future endeavours where the Muntz name is used, underneath it, it always says, not affiliated with Muntz TV. So Muntz Television carried on after Muntz left, and Muntz went on to do other things. The next big thing was the tape cartridge. Now, whilst Muntz might have played a fool in the past, he was clearly not one. He was a very astute business person. I mean, now he'd had businesses in automotive and electronics. He was putting both those two things together into the idea of a tape-based cartridge player for the car. And you've got to think this isn't something that any of the large manufacturers of electronics or the automotive industry had thought up. No, it was down to an ex-used car salesman to see the potential of this idea. And yet in the past, of course, there'd been car radios and there'd been car record players. But a car tape player, that was something that Earl Muntz thought up. And of course, then he needed someone to help him with it. So he got in touch with George Eash. George Eash is credited as the creator of the lubricated tape, but more importantly, he used that lubricated tape in an endless loop tape cartridge. And that tape cartridge was first marketed as the Viking 35 in 1957, when it was used for background music applications. But in 1958, it was also used for a DJ cartridge system. So this was to play advertisements and jingles, etc. And it became known as the Fidelipac, or more commonly as just the cart. And the cart was used by DJs all the way up until the digital age. The Fidelipac was a very successful product, and the Fidelipac is the design that was used in the 4-track. So Earl Muntz, in conjunction with George Eash, adopted the Fidelipac design into something that would be more suitable for use in a vehicle. Now, rather obviously, the cart I've got here is a much more modern one to one of George Eash's from the 1950s, but the design is pretty much the same. All the holes are in the same place, the tape's the same width, perhaps the layout inside is a little bit different, but if I'd got one of the 1950s ones, I could put it in a modern cart machine and it would still play. This design was also the same as used in the 4-track, indistinguishable, but again, it's the layout of the tape on the inside. On the Eash originals, we'd be dealing with a mono system, one track of audio, and another track that contained cue tones that enabled the DJ's cart system to cue up straight to the audio. So as soon as I press the button, it would start playing. I made a video about cart machines in the past. If you want to have a look at that, I'll put a link in the video description. When this went over to the 4-track, the modifications that needed to happen were to be able to fit a full album on here in stereo. So rather than just having one track and a cue track, you need stereo. But also, Even at the speed it's running at 7.5 inches per second, that wouldn't fit much more than perhaps 1, maybe 2 songs on. So to fit a full album on here, you have to slow the tape speed down. So this is running at 7.5 inches per second. Slow it down to 3.75. Then you can fit more on here. The quality, of course, reduces down a bit, but it was proven to be perfectly acceptable by RCA's system, the RCA sound tape cartridge, which came out in the 1950s, which used stereo audio, 3.75 inches per second. I've done a video on that as well. Another innovation on that system, though, was it put 4 tracks on a 1/4-inch tape. And that's exactly what happened on a 4-track system. We've got 4 tracks at 3.75 inches per second, running in parallel interleave with one another. So we've got tracks 1 and 3 on the tape. That's the first program. And then you move the head down and you're playing tracks 2 and 4 for the second program. So you've got 2 stereo programs running in parallel, effectively the side A and side B of your album. So once you've listened to the top half of the tape, which is your side A, you move a little lever, you move the head down, and then you're listening to the second half of the tape. There's no auto switch between those. It's down to the user to move between those 2 programs. But that's how a 4-track worked. They got it to work, it sounded just fine. But the next problem was getting a machine to play that cartridge reliably. It was fine in the home, but getting a unit that could run at a consistent speed off a 12-volt motor in a car proved a lot more tricky. And indeed, when Earl Muntz and George took a demo unit down to Ford in 1961, they took a home unit down with an inverter to demonstrate this to them. But eventually they managed to get a motor that worked consistently, and they teamed up with Japanese manufacturers to make the electronics. So the Japanese made the players, but Muntz over in the US, they were going to manufacture the cartridges. And they're also going to license the music to put on the cartridges and duplicate that music as well. Now, as far as the manufacturers go, well, there's 2 names they used in Japan. One you've probably heard of, Clarion. The second one is Maruwa Electronics and Chemical Company Limited, sometimes shortened to MECA. Now, as far as the cabinets go, those were also manufactured in the US. So it was just a mechanism that was imported from Japan and then inserted into these cabinets that were made in the US. So the 4-track came out in 1963. They sold 1,300 units that year, mostly to the rich and famous, based in LA. Muntz had moved to LA when he came up with this idea because he thought the car culture there and all the celebs and the money that's flowing around and the good weather would be a perfect place to launch this product. Once one person had got a 4-track tape player in the car, other people wanted it as well. So it proved to be a good idea. And let's look at a real world example. I managed to get hold of one a few years ago, and ever since I bought it, I just kept it in the box. So I wasn't sure whether this thing would actually work. Of course, I had to import it from the US. That's the only place I've ever seen these for sale, both the machines and the cartridges. But looking back at some of the documents from the time, it does seem like they sold them around the world. So you could perhaps find 4-tracks in other places, but I've only ever found them in the US. So I bought one from there. I've got it to show you. Enough of the history for the moment. Let's take a look at a 4-track player. Okay, now inside this box, to the best of my knowledge, should be a Muntz stereo-pak machine, a 4-track cartridge player, dated from the late 1960s. I haven't opened it up yet. I think it might be new old stock, not too sure. It's still sealed from when I purchased it, and that was well over 5 years ago, so we're going to find out today. Now, there's a couple of clues on here as to what's inside. Apparently the model's an H3500, and you can see here, warranty void November 69. So that gives a bit of a date to this thing. It's no doubt preceding that by about a year or so. Looking at this on the bottom left, we've got a Jan 68 date by the looks of it. And I've just spotted this, I don't know if you can see it on the video. There's a very faint stamp here that spells out Muntz. Yeah, so it seems likely that inside this box is going to be a Muntz stereo-pak machine. I don't know what state it's going to be in after being inside a box for 50 odd years. It's looking all right so far. Slide it out carefully. And there we go. Well, I suspect that this might be a lightly used version. There's a couple of little marks on it, but it's in pretty good condition looking at the exterior. And I didn't realise that this was going to be an all-in-one unit with a speaker either side. I managed to find this model in an old advert. It's the one dead centre of the screen at $79.95. So that's 1968. If you adjust that amount for inflation to 2024, that's $723 nowadays. Okay, so getting back to the history, whilst the unit I've got might be a home console unit, the centre part of it, the mechanism, is the same as they would have been putting into vehicles at the time. And it was that market they were concentrating on, the aftermarket automotive industry. You can either buy a unit and install it yourself, or buy one and get it installed at one of Muntz's installation centres. These were primarily based around California. Their flagship operation was in Van Nuys, and that one apparently could take 175 installations in a day. The vehicles were pulled through on a conveyor belt system, much the same as in an automated car wash. And the car would go in, 4 people would attack the vehicle, installing this 4-track system, putting the unit under the dash, putting the speakers in the doors, wiring it all in. And from beginning to end, that process apparently took 4.5 minutes to get the 4-track installed. And it cost you $10, and that included the speakers as well. So they had a very efficient operation going at this point. And in the second year on sale, they sold 18,000 4-track players, but that would be nothing compared to what was coming in 1966. 1966 was really the breakout year for the 4-track player. Not only were Muntz selling you the machines, or installing them if you wanted to, they were also selling you the cartridges. They were licensing the music to put on the cartridges, and they were duplicating the tape as well. They had the whole operation, and they had the retail just for the cartridges as well. And these were usually manned by young, attractive ladies who were on commission to sell you cartridges and players. In addition, Billboard had a 33-page centre spread all about Earl Muntz in celebration of his achievements with the 4-track cartridge system. So 1966, great year, apart from it was also the beginning of the end, because there was a rival on the market in the 8-track, which had been launched in 1965, but already by 1966 it was getting quite a lot of traction. It was a dark cloud on the horizon, and within just a couple of years or so, it would pretty much see off the 4-track completely. Looking back at the press of the time, it seems like 1967 was the last year when it looks like 4-track and 8-track were in a proper fight, and perhaps either of them could have won. Well, that was the impression certainly being given out by Muntz, who wanted everyone to know that 4-track was better than 8-track. There was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes, though, that meant that 4-track didn't stand a chance. However, in 1967, the turnover was $35 million. So it was still a pretty viable business. It's amazing how quickly it disappeared in the next couple of years. But remember, the machine I'm looking at seems to be from 1968, so that's really the very tail end of the 4-track era, and you won't find many more that were manufactured after that. Anyway, let's get back and have a look at that machine, see how I'm getting on with it. Okay, so the controls here, we've got loudness, separation and contour. Yeah, interesting. And this lever has a position number 1 at the top and 2 at the bottom, and that's moving the head between the 2 programs. Yeah, the head looks fine. I can't really see any wear on it, but if we look to the left, there's a piece of either plastic or metal sticking out there, and it appears that there's been a tape pulled across that because there are some marks on it. Let's just see if this tape head moves. Oh yeah, that's going up and down. Okay, I think the next thing we need to do is open this up and see if there's a belt still inside. Well, of course, it'll still be inside. We just need to see what state it is and whereabouts it ended up. But let's just have a look at the back of this first of all. Yeah, so this sticker tells us it's the new Muntz stereo, designed and engineered in California, made in Japan. And again, we've got that warranty void date of November 69. We can see it runs on 170 volts, 60 cycles per second or 60 hertz. So I'm going to use this through a US power bank to get it to run at the right speed. That's if I can get it to run at all. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is take this panel off on the back. I'm intrigued as to what's underneath there. So let's have a look. Well, you can see the cartridge player mechanism is in this centre part here, and we've got the lines going off to the speakers at either side. I suspect that this central unit was used in a number of different devices. Now, the motor is there, So that means the belt is going to be underneath here somewhere. That does look a little bit tricky to get to. I'd have to take all these screws out, and then it's still wired into this part here. You know what? I might just try powering it up and see what happens, because it would be a waste of time taking this whole thing out just to find out that it was fine all along. Let's give it a go. Right, so here's my US Jackery, which will output the correct voltage and hertz. We'll plug it into that, and let's turn it on. Now, nothing's going to happen with this until you put a cartridge in it, and I don't really want to risk one of my 2 4-track carts, so I'm going to put an NAB cart in this instead. I've got plenty more of those, and they're not as valuable. I found a blank one here, so let's try that. Well, I think the motor's going. Let's have a look. Well, there's a hum, but I can't tell you exactly what it's coming from. That motor doesn't feel like it's moving. Well, you can see here from the screen on the Jackery that we are sending 17 watts out, so it's definitely drawing power. But that's pretty much all that's happening at the moment. That tape's not moving. A tiny bit of oxidisation on there. Pity there's no on-off button on this thing. It's all purely based on putting the cartridge in. So let's try that again. Yeah, that's turning on the power, because look what happens when I take that out. Yeah, the power draw has gone down to 3 watts, so that's 3 watts in standby, and then we put the cartridge back in again, and I can hear this humming. I presume that's a combination of the motor and perhaps the amplifiers, but then we're back up to 17 watts as well. But yeah, that's definitely not spinning, so we do need to take all the insides out of this and have a good look at what we've got. Looking at this, I'm wondering if these are plugs that can be pulled out. Let's find out. Oh yeah, right, so I've got to remember which is the top on these. I think I might mark it up with a little bit of Tipex or something just to indicate which one goes where, because once we've taken all those out we can then slide out the mechanism from the centre. Turns out there's no Tipex in the house because it's not the 1980s. I'm going to put a bit of tape on these instead, just to mark top dead centre on each one. Right, so I can unplug these now. Right, so this will now be free to slide out of the back once I remove these 4 screws holding it in the case. Right, there is our 4-track cartridge player. Let's flip it over. And there's no belt to be seen. Where is it? Can't have just disappeared. I think I want to take this piece of card out to see what's underneath here. Still getting no closer to finding a belt though. Okay, well this is the flywheel here. Ah, I think it might all be there. Yeah, looks to be something on there. So let's take out those 2 screws and take this whole thing out of the top. Okay, let's have a look at this. Well, that's it. That's what's left of the belt. That's crazy. Where's the rest of this gone? Is it stuck inside here somewhere? I'm going to have a good look. Now that has come off the other side, so I'll have to put that back on as well. But yeah, we need to just crumble that off there. But that's hardly anything. There must be more inside here. Yeah, so looking at that capstan, it does appear that it's played quite a few tapes, so this is not a new device. Well, it's certainly not new now, anyway. I think I might want to take that off there. That's like a cooling fan, but also it's on top of the motor. And I just want to check there's nothing stuck underneath there. There is a little screw here, which will enable me to take that off. So let's do that. Yeah, I found some more belt remnants on this, so it's a good job that we took that off. I'll need to give this a clean as well. Yeah, now of course I'm going to clean this properly with some isopropyl alcohol, but for the moment I need to pop it back on so that we can measure for a new belt. Now fortunately the old belt has left behind one of its dimensions. We can see the width of it here. So let's just measure that. Yeah, perhaps 3.5 millimeters wide. Something like that, just under 4. I'll see what I can get. You don't have to be too accurate with this. Okay, well that's one of the dimensions. Let's see if we can figure out the other one. Okay, so to do that we need to reassemble things. I'm going to put this string around the part that goes on the motor, and then we need to pop the big flywheel back on again. Okay, this is all very rough, but we'll just put marks here and there and cut the string at that point. Okay, so that's our belt. Let's measure it up. Okay, so it's around about 32 centimetres in length. So if we just shorten that to a nice round 30, we might be about right. Okay, so I've taken the measurements from here. I've ordered a belt. While I wait for that, might as well clean off the residue that's been left behind by the old belt. And it looks like that's going to be easier said than done, because isopropyl alcohol isn't really shifting it. I'm going to try some acetone on that in a moment, but we'll try this section here. Now, I notice on this capstan, this part here is a different material, so that's to make sure the tape grips as it passes by. And again, that one is going to take a little bit of shifting to get back to the coating that's underneath. Yeah, let's get some acetone on this and see what happens. Right, now this stuff should clean it off. Let's give it a go. Yeah, that's working better, definitely. Yeah. Right, well that's all the muck removed. There are still some marks from where the tape's moved across it, but when I feel it, it's nice and smooth, so that's good enough. Let's see if we can clean this off. Yeah, that'll do. Again, there's some staining on the metal, but it's lovely and smooth. You can't feel any roughness on there at all. Okay, well that's the last remnants of the belt cleaned off, so now we can move on to the rest of the machine. Now this lever on the front moves the head between the two positions. The head's here at the back, and you can see we can move it to the top and the bottom. It does have a habit of getting stuck though, so I need to make sure that's not going to happen once I put the thing back together again. We'll have a look at lubricating that. We're in the upper position at the moment, so that would be playing track 1. Then there's a gap, and then that's playing track 3. And we move the head down. The top one then plays track 2, and that plays track 4. So looking at the whole mechanism, on the right here, the capstan would normally come through this section here. That is our playhead, and then there's a little bit of sponge here on the left, which is just pushing the tape into the cartridge. And that is it, a very simple mechanism. And I can see what's causing it to stick. If I just put my little stick in here, you can see there's a peg. And when we move this part forward, that drops into a hole. So that is what's making the head move up and down. And there's just a bit of dried up grease on there, I think. So we just need to make sure that is all cleaned off and we get some new clean grease on it. Now you'll notice inside the bottom here, that's our pinch roller, which is brought up inside the cartridge and pushes the tape against the capstan. Now in the early devices, once you'd inserted the cartridge, you'd operate a lever which would bring that up inside the cart. On some of the DJ cart machines, you'll press a button, a solenoid will be activated to bring that up. This is a later model as far as the 4-track goes, so it's automated but only in a mechanical sense. It's down to the insertion of the cartridge to push this up. The way it does that, you can see we've got this plastic peg here at the back, and if I was to operate that, you'll see the wheel come up, the pinch roller, and catch my finger, and it is really quite pressured, that, so I just need to push it down. There we go. Right, so it comes up like so. And then once you take the cartridge out, you're pulling that back out again with the actual cartridge itself. So it's quite a rough mechanism on the carts, this one really. So I'm just going to insert a cart here. So we get it to this position, and then that's it. It's clicked up inside, but then it's really held fast in there. In fact, I can pick the whole thing up and hold it by the cartridge, and it doesn't want to come out. You really have to give it a good pull to get that out of there. So yeah, perhaps not the most elegant solution, but you know, perhaps better than operating a lever, especially on one of these car models. Some had like a plunger that you could pull on the front. But one thing about having the wheel, the pinch roller in the bottom there, is that it's always going to make the cross section of this rather thick, a lot deeper than an 8-track, because the 8-track has got the pinch roller inside the cartridge. you could just get away with this top section here really, but we've got to hide it down in the bottom here. But with the pinch roller popped up into position, I can see that it's in a really good state. It just needs a bit of a clean, and we can carry on using this one. Oh, and I should mention, once the cartridge is inserted, it pushes onto this switch here, and that's what's going to activate the motor. You can see here on the motor, that's backing up our 1968 date. It could be the 12th week of 1968. It's manufactured by KTA, and it's an AC motor, hence the need to have a step-down power transformer with a sine wave converter to supply this with 60 Hz rather than the UK's 50. Now, before the belt arrives, another thing I want to do is clean these potentiometers. We noticed they were rather crackly on that initial test. Underneath here you can see that you can't really access them very easily from this side. You could perhaps take this whole circuit board out, which would be a bit of a pain. Loads of wires, lots of messing around, and no need to do it, because the way these work, I can see looking through the little gap here that it's all exposed on the top of them. There's metal leaves that are pushing down on metal discs, so it's just a matter of spraying my deoxit through the top of these and then rubbing them back and forth a few times to clean off any oxidization. Okay, well, we'll only see if that's done anything once we get the whole thing reassembled, so I've got to wait for that belt now to arrive in the post. Right, so things are going well here. Perhaps not so well back in the 1960s for Earl Muntz and the 4-track. The big problem was Bill Lear. You might be more familiar with his name because of Learjet. That's a company that he created when he was 60 years old in 1962. He sold it 5 years later for $28 million. So that's perhaps what he's most famous for now, but it does go back a long way before then, and indeed he's crediting himself as being the creator of the first car radio. He was working for a battery manufacturing company. In 1928, he put this invention on the boss's desk, and they decided to call it the Motorola. The company changed its name to Motorola shortly after that. So Bill Lear also created Motorola, and he got out of that business. He sold it to the other chap. He kept a third of the shares and then moved on to do other things. Within just a few years, though, he was broke. However, he then got a contract with RCA for $250,000 for the front end for their radios called the Magic Brain. But yeah, to cut a long story short, Bill Lear, way more than just Learjet. He got 150 patents. He developed things like aviation, guidance systems. He got automotive patents, electronics, radio, it goes on. But he must have had a bit of a sense of humour as well, because he called his daughter Shanda. Yeah, Chandelier. But in addition to that, he was a licensee of Muntz's 4-track system. But when he saw it, he thought, well, I can do better than this. And he set about doing that. Now, what he came out with, you could argue whether it was better or worse. Lear certainly thought it was better. Muntz thought it was worse. It has its pros and cons. Let's look at those. So imagine we're looking at the end of the cartridge here. We're looking down on the tape, 4-track being split into 4 tracks, and rather obviously 8-track into 8. The reason the 4-track has the potential to sound better than the 8-track, despite them both using the same width of tape and playing the tape at the same speed, is because each program, a program being a stereo pair, 1 and 3 or 2 and 4, is playing more tape, a greater width. Therefore there's more oxide passing by the playhead. And the result of that is you're getting a good strong signal coming through. You don't have to boost that audio all that much. Whereas on an 8-track, a little narrow bit coming through, quieter signal, has to be boosted up. And by boosting it up, you're also boosting the inherent tape hiss that's in the background. You're most likely to get more hiss out of an 8-track than a 4-track. Another disadvantage of 8-track is the fact it's got these 8 tracks, so the playhead has to be very accurate. The playhead for an 8-track plays tracks 1 and 5 for the stereo pair, program 1, and then 2 and 6 for program 2, 3 and 7 for program 3, and 4 and 8 for program 4. That is a very narrow area to hit accurately. As a result, a poorly aligned head, which is more often than not the case, you'll hear audio bleeding through from the next track along. It might even be down to the duplication of that particular tape or just how it rests inside the cartridge. But because it's such a narrow tolerance, if the head isn't perfectly aligned, you're going to hear crosstalk. Whereas on a 4-track tape, A lot more room to play around with, much less likely to hear crosstalk. Another perhaps advantage of the 4-track, with it just having these two programs, those could be the equivalent of side A and side B of your album. 8-track, it's got 4 breaks on here. You're more likely to have tracks that have to be truncated, split in the middle. You'll find that it fades out and then it goes clunk and then it fades back in when it's on the next program. But talking of that clunk, that is one of the benefits of the 8-track. The 8-track could automatically move to the next program. There was a piece of foil at the tape splice, so once it's done the full rotation of the tape, hits the foil, the sensor inside the machine recognises that and moves ahead down to the next program. Effectively, you put the cartridge in, you can play through the whole thing without any interaction at all. 4-track doesn't do that. It just plays the same program over and over until you move the lever to play the other one. Advantage of the 4-track though, another one, the pinch roller was inside the machine, so you get a quality pinch roller in there. 8-track, you're relying on the cart manufacturers who want to make the cheapest possible cart that they could, so they'll throw in a rubbishy hard plastic one or one that might be sticky and pull your tape into it. And finally, perhaps the most obvious advantage of the 8-track is that it could hold twice as much music as a 4-track, but since that all either format was generally required to do was to hold the equivalent of 1 LP, they could both do that. That wasn't all that important. So in summary, there are pros and cons to both, but the headline is that the 4-track had the potential to provide better audio quality, whilst the 8-track was simpler and more convenient to use. Now, as we've seen over the years, quality rarely wins out over convenience. Most people will go for the convenience option every time, but this really wasn't all that much of a fair fight anyway, because on one side we've got Earl "Madman" Muntz, an ex-used car salesman, mostly based in California, seems to have a bit of a habit of rubbing people up the wrong way as well. When I read through the old press, various people suing each other over not paying things, so seems to be a bit of a maverick, put it that way. And he's going up against Bill Lear, who is really kind of old school. He's in his mid-60s at this point. He doesn't really need to work anymore. He's got money coming out of his ears. He's got tie-ins in the past with creating Motorola. He's got affiliations with RCA. So when he comes out with his new system, he gets Motorola to manufacture the units. He gets RCA to provide the music, the artists, for his new Stereo 8 system. But most importantly, he manages to get Ford to sign on to have this as a manufacturer fit option. Started in July 1965, Ford started promoting this with a multi-million-dollar campaign for their 1966 range. By just a year later, 1966, for the 67 model year range, all the major motor manufacturers in the US were offering the Stereo 8 as a manufacturer fit, and on top of that, by 1967 all the major record labels had agreed to issue their music on Stereo 8 as well. So there was a lot of momentum behind the 8-track cartridge, a lot more than behind the 4-track. Over on that side, well, they managed to get the players down to less than $40. The carts now had been reduced in price, so they were a little bit cheaper than 8-tracks. However, there was really no way to compete once all the manufacturers were offering the 8-track cart system. With Muntz, the fire they had in 1968 in one of their duplicating plants really can't have helped at all. They were having a lot of trouble with people doing bootleg copies. They were having trouble with returns from places that hadn't sold them, so they had to give the money back for those, or they hadn't been paid for their initial shipment. On top of that, Capitol Records pulled out of the 4-track system. Remember, Muntz is licensing all the music from all these different record labels and doing the duplication. Well, he could just start pulling those licenses and saying, oh, we'll do the duplication ourselves, thanks very much. So every individual revenue stream is getting pulled away from Muntz. And on top of this, retailers were getting fed up having to stock 2 different cartridge types for each album title, all that inventory. They were happy to drop one of them, and if they were going to drop one, it was going to be the 4-track. And even though there was going to be some people who were still buying cartridges for a few years, people who'd already got the systems installed, even by 1970, when they asked one retailer what the split was between 8-track and 4-track as far as sales go, it was 75% to the 8-track. Okay, the belt has arrived. I hope I measured this right. We'll find out in a moment. Now, when I get this out of the packet and put it around here, we're going to be popping this through that hole. And the centre part of this glides on a ring of grease that you can still see there in grey. Now that's the original grease, and I think I should probably clean that off and put some new grease in its place. It does still feel greasy, but I'm sure after all these years, some new grease will help this thing run a little bit smoother. When I think about it, it's probably best to put this through here first, get it located into position, and then pop the belt on afterwards. So that's spinning nice and smoothly. Flip it over though, on this side, inside this column here, originally there was a little felt washer that it went through, and then on top of that there was this rubber one to hold everything in place. So I'm just going to pop those back into position. Okay, that was a little bit fiddly, but everything's in place. Okay, so we'll get the belt on here first, and then I'm going to hold it in place with the clamp which goes over the top. Okay, so now we need to transfer this end over this pulley. Okay, well that looks just fine. The belt's not too tight, everything's running nice and smoothly, so we've got everything mechanically sorted out. It's just whether or not these electronics are still working. Let's pop it back together again and find out. What I want to do to be able to see this working outside the cabinet is to flip the cabinet the other way up, and that way the wires will reach their respective sides, and then I can flip this thing around and we can operate it outside the cabinet. So we'll do that. Right, well here goes nothing. Let's turn on the power. Pop our cartridge in. Yeah, that's moving just fine. Now this is a blank cartridge, so we're not going to be able to hear anything, but I think that just tells me enough so that I can put the mechanism back inside the carcass and we'll see if it works. Excellent. I think it needs to come out the front first, and then it can pull back and pull all the cloth in around the edges. Otherwise it looks a little bit scruffy. And I now realise I didn't need to take this off after all, so I'll just pop that back on as well. Right, let's screw this back into position. Okay, my work here is done. Whether or not I've done enough, we'll find out in a moment. Okay, so at the moment I own a grand total of 2 4-track cartridges, one from Muntz, one from ITCC. This is James Brown Cold Sweat, and this is Jimmy Smith Hoochie Coochie Man. Let's just have a look at this one, check it's all right. Oh, yeah, the sponges have fallen off the little piece of metal in there. That's a little bit rusty as well. That needs a bit of repair before I can play that. So hopefully James Brown is up for the job. It's the hardest working man in show business. Hopefully he's still working for me. Oh, hold on. No, his sponges have gone as well. I'll show you. Yeah, you can see here, there's a piece of plastic across there, and on top of there should be a pad at either side, and it's not there, so it's not going to push the tape up against the tape head, so we need to replace that. Now, I'm going to try and do that without opening the cartridge up, because I think opening it, I'd have to take a screw out of the middle here, which would damage the label, which would be a bit of a shame. So let's find some pressure pads and try and replace these in situ. Okay, these should do the job. Right, well that looks okay, so let's give it a go.
Make everything all right. Come on now.
I'm over the moon about that. It's working perfectly. Just think this thing is around about 56 years old now. Certainly don't make them like they used to. And they also don't call controls the names they used to here. I was a bit confused with these to start with, but they're all familiar to us nowadays under different names. For example, loudness, well, of course, that's volume. Separation, that's your balance. We've got a white line on this, so moving it all the way to the left would just have the sound coming out of this speaker and vice versa to the right. So we've got volume, balance, and contour. Well, that's what we'd more likely refer to as tone nowadays. So a bit more bassy to the left and a bit more trebly to the right. Now, one thing I haven't tried is this track selector, so let's give that a go.
In a cold sweat, I'm going to Kansas City, here I You got to bring a little box.
That's working well, and it's a great way to get around the copyright bots. They won't be able to recognise this track. unless I get 2 strikes at the same time. But yeah, I'm really very impressed with this. I'm going to get the other cartridge working now. Let's just take that out of there. Right, now this one, the sponge is still in there, so we need to get that out first of all. Now it looks rather rusty in there. I don't want to put my pads onto that because I don't think they'll stick. Fortunately with this one, we can just unscrew it there. So I think we're going to open up the case on this one so that I can take out that piece of metal and polish it before I put some new pads on it. Now once I've taken this screw out, the big question is which way up do I open the cartridge to avoid all the tape spilling out? And I'd suggest it's the other way up. So I'm going to take the screw out, flip it this way up, and hopefully we can get inside here without having a disaster. Yeah, there we go. Excellent. It's very well constructed compared to some of the cheap 8-tracks, this one. Anyway, here's the bit of metal we need to get out. And I just need to give this a good polish.
And then the whole world gonna know.
Now you might be wondering how Bill Lear, with his 8-track cartridge, managed to get away with what seems to be such a blatant copy of the 4-track system without getting sued. Well, of course this is America, and the Lear Corporation was sued. They were sued by Telepro, who were the people who held the patents for George Eash's original system, which became known as the Fidelipac. They claimed patent infringement on Bill Lear with his 8-track. Now you might think it's a pretty cut and dry open and shut case. Yeah, surely the 8-track is a copy of the 4-track. I mean, Bill Lear had a 4-track license and decided to make something better, made the 8-track. They're so similar to one another in size, these things, that you could actually buy a thing called a Gidget that went in the hole for the pinch roller on the 4-track and enabled a 4-track to be playable on an 8-track cartridge machine. They're that much alike. However, the case was thrown out by the judge because he ruled that George Eash's patents were invalid because his endless loop tape cart design was just a modification of an earlier cart system, the Mohawk message repeater, which had got a patent the year before his in 1953. And Bill Lear, well, for him, it was a big win because he got a clean patent on his 8-track cart, despite the fact there'd been all this prior history. Now you might think that Earl Muntz would be broken by all this. It would be something he'd dwell on, he'd just fight against it. No, he was a businessman. He went where the money was. So in April 1965, as soon as the 8-track had been introduced, he licensed the technology from Bill Lear so that he could put his own music out on 8-track cartridges. And he duplicated those cartridges himself. By August 1966, he'd introduced a home machine that could play both 4-track and 8-track cartridges. He was just interested in selling you the hardware and the cartridges as well. He later called those machines 12-track players, and he was quite insistent on 12-track players were going to be the future so that people could play either type of cartridge. But ultimately, the most popular one won out, and that wasn't the 4-track. When you look back at this brief cartridge war, it's very clear that Muntz and Lear, whilst trying to sell very similar products, had very different strategies to how to go about that. On the Muntz side, he was very consumer oriented. He was duplicating the cartridges. He was selling those cartridges directly to the public through his stores. He was installing the players in people's cars as an aftermarket accessory. So all very much on the consumer end. But you go over to Bill Lear and he's very much corporate. So he's signing agreements with motor manufacturers and record labels. And once you control that part of it, it's very easy just to squeeze Earl Muntz out of the picture. You don't need him anymore. The record labels are perfectly able to duplicate their own cartridges. They can use their existing record label distribution systems to sell those. You don't need to install things aftermarket when the motor manufacturers are putting them in straight from being manufactured. So the whole thing just gets squeezed out and Muntz's bit just disappears. And as a result, by 1970, the Muntz Stereo-pak company was sold to a group of 5 investors. Now you might be wondering what's left of the Muntz Stereo-pak company at this point. Why would 5 investors want to be involved in it? Well, there was more to it than just the 4-track. By now they were manufacturing 8-track players. There were other products in the range as well. So this new company, after it had been sold, was called Muntz Stereo, and that happens to be the name on the front of my machine as well. Muntz Stereo carried on until 1971, when 75% of the business was sold to Clarion. You remember Clarion was one of the manufacturers for Muntz. So Clarion now sold products under the brand Muntz by Clarion. However, they dropped that name in 1975. So the Muntz name pretty much disappeared in 1975. But going back to 1972, after the sale to the 5 investors, there'd been an agreement that Muntz had to stay out of the consumer electronics business for a total of 3 years. So since he couldn't do anything, he went back to selling cars again. He sold cars, motorhomes and rented out motorcycles from his lots in California. But as soon as the enforced absence was over, Muntz got straight back into the electronics business again in 1974 with the Muntz Manufacturing Company, and his new interest was rear projection televisions. And ultimately, Muntz rear projection TVs did appear on the market, but under a name that you might be a little bit more familiar with.
This is Sega Vision, a whole new ball game in home entertainment. Sega Vision, for really full coverage. It's nothing like any television you've ever seen before.
Yeah, it's that Sega. They'd bought out the Muntz Manufacturing Company in 1976. And then based on the technology that he developed, they went on to bring out the Sega Vision large screen television in 1977. Apparently, it wasn't a big seller. But then again, like other Muntz products, perhaps it was just a little bit ahead of its time. OK, let's round things off with some sightings of the 4-track in movies and on TV, and I'm going to cap this off with the most tenuous bit of trivia about the 4-track ever. So this model of player can be seen in the 1966 Paul Newman film Harper. It's an early 4-track player that's capable of playing multiple sizes of carts, as you can see from the ones to the left of it, and it also has a manually operated pinch roller lever that Newman seems to struggle a little bit in operating. 4-track players also made 9 appearances in the Mission Impossible TV series in the mission briefing section at the start. However, there were only 2 scenes shot that were then reused multiple times. It made its first appearance with Dan Briggs in the first season, and rather than self-destructing, the tape in this was disposed of in a fire. And I've got to say, it's a bit rough with the props, and that's a really odd way to slap the cart down as well. Jim Phelps' use of the 4-track was a bit more traditional, although the player doesn't seem to have been installed very well. The whole thing shifts when he engages the pinch roller, but I suppose that's what you get with a 4.5-minute install. The tape in the cart also appears to be a bit bunched up, so perhaps it's a good job that this one did self-destruct.
This recording will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Good luck, Jim.
And finally, here's the most tenuous story that I could muster about the 4-track. Trini Lopez was a singer and actor. He was one of the Dirty Dozen.
Trini Lopez as Jimenez.
He's crawling with hate.
He was also one of the artists on the 4-track cart, and whilst over in Monaco, he gifted a 4-track player and presumably his album to Prince Rainier, no doubt in a publicity stunt set up by Muntz. The Prince was a massive car enthusiast, but the only car in Monaco at this point that had a 4-track player installed in it was this white Mustang, and this was owned by the wife of Bobby Weiss, who was Monument Records' international director. And UK viewers will recognise the people in this car as the comedy duo Morecambe and Wise, and that's because at this point the car was being loaned to them for the use in their 1966 film, That Riviera Touch. Anyway, before Prince Rainier installed his new 4-track player, presumably to make sure it didn't end up like the ones in Mission Impossible, he asked the Weisses if they could call around to his palace to show them the installation in the Mustang so he could see how best to do it. Unfortunately, you don't get to see the interior of the Mustang in the film, and I don't know which of Rainier's cars he put his player in. So if you ever do get a chance to visit the Monaco Car Museum that holds all his old cars, try and find out if one still has a 4-track player in it. Although I do suspect he will have been able to afford to swap it out for something a bit more modern. So there you go, that was the story of the Muntz stereo-pak 4-track cartridge. An interesting little footnote in history, but one which paved the way for things to come. I can't think there are too many people who are able to play a 4-track cartridge in the UK. If you're one of them, let me know. But in the meantime, I'll be playing mine.